Hi there, folks. This is Dr. Robert Cywes, the Carb Addiction Doc. And today we're going to try to explain something that most doctors out there don't understand, and that is the difference between prediabetes and insulin resistance. And this is such a fundamentally important concept to understand when it comes to modern diseases and chronic non-communicable diseases. In other words, the most likely reason why you are going to die and get sick. Okay, so the way this works is that the human body is designed to use insulin to perform a variety of different tasks in the body. And when the body is sensitive to tiny fluctuations in insulin, insulin's primary role is to control the production and release of sugar from the liver. And the hormone that is directly responsible for that is a hormone called glucagon. So insulin, when it becomes micro-elevated, insulin becomes micro-elevated to a micro increase in your blood sugar when you're insulin sensitive, insulin then, in a fluctuating way, it's not on or off, it's not a switch, it's not binary, it's a continuous fluctuation, kind of a vibration of insulin. Insulin modifies glucagon's release of sugar from the bloodstream. When your blood sugar dips a little bit low, insulin levels go down, glucagon produces a little bit more, and then insulin gets produced and glucagon goes down. Okay, so that's the direct effect. The second effect that insulin does have is it has a longer standing effect on steroid hormone production. And the steroid hormones we're talking about here are the adrenalins, the catecholamines, and in particular cortisol. And cortisol starts out as a cholesterol precursor. So it starts out as this molecule called cholesterol. Yeah, cholesterol, the thing that everybody tells you is going to kill you, is actually vitally important to being human. So stop with the damn cholesterol is bad for you. That's bullshit. Anyway, that's a tangent. Cholesterol is a precursor for steroid hormones. So cholesterol will become cortisol, but insulin modifies the enzymes that convert cholesterol downstream. So insulin not only has a direct effect on glucagon, it also affects all of the catecholamine production. And when you're sensitive, there's these slight fluctuations. So that's how you can modify the dawn effect. For example, when you wake up in the morning, you get a little cortisol rush, it affects glucagon, your blood sugar goes up. Well, if insulin is blocking the glucagon and insulin is affecting cortisol production, you've got all these fluctuations that are controlling each other and managing your fluctuations in a very healthy way. And that's insulin sensitivity. Insulin also affects the rate at which cells take sugar up from the bloodstream. Insulin affects every cell in the body, pretty much. There's some, like the red blood cells, where it doesn't really affect them, but almost every cell with a nucleus has an insulin receptor, and those receptors allow sugar to enter the bloodstream. There are some cells, like endothelial cells, that will allow also sugar to enter the cell without insulin. And by the way, insulin doesn't really have an effect on fructose as much as it does on glucose and galactose. So fructose tends to be one of your most dangerous sugars because it doesn't trigger insulin release. That's very sophisticated. So insulin allows sugar to enter all the cells. And the reason sugar should be entering the cells is to be used as energy. Not to be converted to fat, but to be used as directly as energy or stored in some cells a little bit of glycogen. And then insulin also affects fat uptake and fat release from the fat cells by regulating an enzyme called lipoprotein lipase, amongst a few other effects. So that as your blood sugar rises, your ketone production goes down, and it should balance those two. And remember, glucagon not only converts amino acids to sugar as gluconeogenesis, it also is ketogenic when you're fat adapted, producing ketones. So it's an incredibly intricate system, and it's so beautiful. It's so beautiful. It's like a little dance. It's like a vibrating wire is the way I look at this, with little dampeners. That's the way the human body should work. And it's cyclical. It's all about nuance feedback. And the more sensitive you are, the tighter that control, the less fluctuation there is. Now, along comes modern America. You have to eat carbohydrates. You have to snack. So we sit there stuffing our face with all the sugar and starch. And even if you're following the standard American diet perfectly, it's 60% carbohydrates. Even if you're on a ketogenic diet with a carbohydrate allowance, you're still putting sugar in your face. Sugar that the human body actually doesn't need. And what does that do? It's like if you look at a pond with no breeze on it looks perfectly fat. Obviously, if you look at it under a microscope, the water's slightly vibrating. It's called a Brownian effect. But the vibrations are tiny. That's a healthy hormonal environment. Now you come along and you drop a grain of sand on that pond, and there's a slight little ripple. You might be able to see it, you might not. And that's maybe eating a carnivore or an ultra low carbohydrate diet. But then you come along and throw a darn rock, a brick, into the pond, and the pond just explodes, and you get this tsunami effect of the ripples. That's like eating carbohydrates, folks. And if you're throwing rocks into that pond all the time, think about what that water's doing. It's doing this all the time. How the hell can your body cope? And eventually all that water spills over the edges of the container and you lose water. That's damage and disease happening. That's my easiest example of insulin resistance. So what happens is when you're consuming carbohydrates in a chronic excessive way, as big meals, as little snacks, and it doesn't matter how those carbohydrates into your face. I don't care if it's a baked potato, French fries. I don't care if it's brown pasta, white pasta. I don't care if it's ice cream or an apple. Sugar is sugar by the time it enters your bloodstream, folks. Sugar is sugar. And those rocks of sugar that bounce into your bloodstream cause these wide fluctuations in insulin, wide fluctuations in your blood sugar. But the body is so cool to adapt to that. I'm insulin sensitive. Okay? I'm fat adapted insulin sensitive. My blood sugar, the total amount of sugar in my bloodstream is about 4 to 5 grams. If I went and ate an apple, that's about 25 to 30 grams that immediately rushes into my bloodstream. And yet, because my body's insulin sensitive, it can cope with that one rock falling into my pond. But if I'm eating apples and ice cream and everything all the time and just plunging those rocks in, the next step, the next way in which my body protects itself is to become resistant to the influence of those hormones. So you become insulin resistant. Well, that means that sugar is now building up in your bloodstream, and your body doesn't want that because that's causing damage. So if you are a high producer of insulin, if your pancreas genetically has the capacity to produce massive amounts of insulin, no matter how resistant your tissues become to insulin, the pancreas says, screw you boys, here's more insulin, do your darn job, and it overwhelms the system. So your liver still is converting sugar to fat, your tissues are still taking them up. Even though it's harming the tissues, it's protecting your bloodstream from cardiovascular effects, from endothelial effects. So you can have a relatively normal blood sugar, a normal hemoglobin A1C, because that's damage to red blood cells, which are floating around in your bloodstream. You protect them, but you become enormous. So the first way in which the human body protects itself from this massive overload of sugar is to rapidly convert the sugar to fat, and you gain weight. That's weight gain. It doesn't come from eating too much steak or fat because your body won't allow you to. So you begin to gain weight, but then eventually the insulin resistance overwhelms your ability to produce insulin, and you can no longer convert that sugar to fat. And then what happens is that sugar starts to build up. And it's that sugar that builds up that slowly damages your red blood cells. Now, red blood cells are turning over about every 110 to 120 days. So what we measure in those red blood cells is something called hemoglobin A1C, which is where the hemoglobin becomes permanently attached to glucose and it damages the hemoglobin. And that's the percentage of cells that are damaged, which is your percent A1C. So what happens is slowly, as you become insulin resistant, your A1C rises, but it only rises because insulin is not that effective at clearing sugar from the bloodstream. So when you test somebody walks into my office, they may be fat, they may not be. The first number I test is insulin and C-peptide because I want to know if they're insulin resistant or they're insulin sensitive. If they're insulin sensitive, the insulin number should be, I like to see 4 or below. I'll tolerate between 4 and 6, but typically 4 or lower. That means that it's just Brownian motion that's happening in their bodies. If their insulin is enormously high, let's say it's above 10, which is still actually in the normal range of insulin, which is ludicrous. I've seen insulin as high as 78, 80. But let's say your insulin is elevated above 10. The next number I want to look at is your hemoglobin A1C. And if your hemoglobin A1C is normal, I know that that person is insulin resistant, and they're going to have some of the steroid hormone effects of their insulin resistance, but their likelihood of developing type 2 diabetes is extremely low as long as they can manage that A1C and their blood sugar, because that's what it's reflective of. On the other hand, and that's called insulin resistance type 1, where your insulin level is high, but your A1C and your blood sugars are in the normal range. Maybe upper end of the normal range, but they're normal range. But then you reach a peak of insulin resistance, and now your A1C starts to rise. It's still below 6.5. That's insulin resistance type 2, which is where your blood sugar starts rising out of the normal range, which is capped at about 100, and your A1C is rising because you're insulin resistant, but you can't produce enough insulin to maintain a normal blood sugar. And that, folks, is what I call type 2 diabetes. Because for me, type 2 diabetes is where that chronically elevated blood sugar starts to affect all of your organs supplied by blood. And I care about the damage being done by the disease, not a number at which you treat. Because that's when people should start a ketogenic diet to eliminate that rise in blood sugar. So then what happens is that situation continues for a longer period of time. And now your A1C slowly creeps up and you get to 6.5, and that's when most endocrinologists would start treatment for diabetes and they call you diabetic. But the paradox is, for early type 2 diabetes, your insulin is elevated, but may not be that high. It might be 9, 10, 14. Okay? It's elevated above the 4, but not massively elevated. But your pancreas can no longer produce sugar above that level, and your insulin resistance is greater than the insulin you can produce. So now you're diabesogenic. And that is prediabetes diabetes. On the other hand, if you can continue to produce more and more insulin and keep a normal blood sugar, IR1, you are insulin resistant, but your likelihood of type 2 diabetes is pretty close to zero. Thank your parents for good genes. Obviously, at some stage, the whole system is going to collapse and die. But the important thing is that the disease spectrum is different. So, for example, women with polycystic ovarian syndrome are insulin resistant, they're not pre-diabetic. Women that have gestational diabetes were pre-diabetic, they weren't necessarily insulin resistant. And it's important to understand those nuances because it's a different disease spectrum that occurs with both. But your fattest people are often cardiovascularly the healthiest people. So I can see someone who's 300 pounds and has a normal CAC score, a coronary artery calcium score. I can see people who weigh 200 pounds, but they're type 2 diabetic and their CAC scores are in the thousands. That's the difference between cardiovascular damage and not, based upon the way insulin resistance over prediabetes works. So those are important metrics, and there are very, very few people out there that understand the difference. The treatment algorithm still remains removing carbohydrates from your life and the pattern of eating, which is snacking. But the tracking, the monitoring is different. So an insulin-resistant person with high insulin should never require a statin. Well, nobody really should require a statin, but to put those people on statins is ludicrous. Okay? What you want to do there is lower their triglycerides, because typically their triglycerides are high because they're turning all that sugar to soluble fat, the shorter chain triglycerides. On the other hand, the diabetic people, you want to worry about cardiovascular disease, and you want to control their cardiovascular risk much more closely. Those are probably the people that might benefit from an aspirin or even a blood thinner, although I'm not a big fan of those. Really, the treatment is to come off carbohydrates. But as doctors, we need to understand those too, because otherwise we are going to mistreat people. We're going to assume that the person with a normal A1C and normal blood sugar has no risk. And we're going to assume that the person with an elevated blood sugar and an elevated A1C is at high risk. So we've got to understand that distinction. And if you as a patient are going to see your doctor, demand that they check your C-peptide, that they check your insulin, that they check your A1C and your fasting blood sugar, as well as a lipid panel. Because you need all of those numbers to be able to understand what your genetics are. I hope this helps. Now, one other comment. Athletes. Athletes all look wonderfully fit. But the question every athlete has to ask is, what is happening inside my bloodstream based upon what I'm putting in my face? Because you can look absolutely strong, huge, very fit. You can run a marathon in half an hour. Not really, that's coming. But you can be extremely athletic and yet be very, very sick inside your body if you're a carb loader. And that's what athletes don't understand. Right now, when I'm in my 20s and I'm fit and I'm doing great, I'm fine. But where am I in my 30s, my 40s, my 50s? Am I going to join that dead runner society because my internal health is terrible? And it's only measurable when you measure those numbers. So I would urge every athlete to get an insulin C-peptide measured. Because your doctor will not understand that you come in looking like an Adonis. You come in looking like Hercules. But inside you're rotting because of the damage you're doing by what you put on your face. Diabetes happens as soon as those carbohydrates enter your bloodstream. You cannot burn them off through exercise. So if your insulin number is above 4 to 6 and you're an athlete, you have a problem busy happening. Modify your diet, modify what you're eating and drinking to see if you can bring that insulin down. I promise you, long term, it will not harm, it will actually improve your performance. But for a lot of our athletes, their diet is a performance reducing drug, a PRD. Understand that.